book on black elk.
It's a real, you'll
Yeah.
not even recognize that one.
I think that's a nice photo of it.
It is. Coffee.
Right.
Make your own waffles. This is continental breakfast.
Okay, we're ready to begin. I'd like to welcome everyone to a conversation with Utah's urban folk revival pioneers. My name's Polly Stewart, and as it happened, yeah, you didn't see that, did you? Yeah. Well, we worried greatly about what the title would be, and there really isn't any way to describe what we are, but I guess we could call it a geezer gathering. Because that's what we are. We're talking about things that happened 40 and 45 years ago in Salt Lake City. And I'm actually one of the sort of pioneers, because I was involved in the folk revival, what came later to be known as the folk revival movement. There is a lot of definitional problem connected with the term urban folk revival. Every single one of those terms is problematical, and I think we may be talking about that. But what we're also going to be doing in this session is what amounts to oral history. It's going to be personal reminiscence of these folks and myself who were there and were participating in whatever it was that was happening in Salt Lake City and the Wasatch Front around the late 50s and early 60s. I would like to introduce the participants. These are the only the ones I could gather. There were others, but I couldn't snag them. But anyway, this is Barry Tolkien, Hal Cannon, and Rosalie Sorrells, and each of them will be requested to just talk a little bit about their own experience and what they have to say. And it seems to me that we're going to have personal experience, but we're also going to have the possibility for talking about the larger picture, what was going on in the United States at that time, what was going on in the world at that time, the cultural scene, a lot of things that really are very important to what eventually ended up happening here. And so there isn't any, quote, format, except I'm just going to ask people to speak. The audience is going to be invited to participate. We don't have any mics, so we don't need to worry about mics. If you want to say something, you just speak up nice and loud, and it will be recorded. This session, because it is a conversations format, is going to be recorded, is being videotaped, courtesy of the American Folklore Society. And all the plenaries were done this way as well. And they will be we're told that they will be made up into DVD format packages for sale, so that if you wanted to get a copy of this, you could do that. The background of this session is that over the course of several years, there was a project that was headed up by Dave Stanley, who is here in our midst, who is the editor of a book called Folklore in Utah, and you've probably seen it. It's just been issued. And it consisted of a number of chapters written by Utah folklorists and researchers about the study of folklore in Utah. I happen to be a press reader for the manuscript, and so I read it, and what I saw was that there was some sort of peripheral mention of this movement in Salt Lake City that was so very important 40 and 45 years ago, but there wasn't any story about it. And I realized that the reason for that is that this is completely ephemeral. Only the people who had a direct experience and memory of this time would have any idea that it ever happened. There was, and we'll all be talking about this in various ways, but there was we were on the wind. I mean, you know, we had a little newsletter and this kind of thing, but where are the newsletters now? So the only material that these researchers had for Dave's book were people who were able to get into the Harold Bentley papers at the University Archive, and so he had something to do with this, but there really was not that much around. So I pitched a fit, and I said, there's got to be a record of this. This is too important to just not exist. And so I talked with John Alley at the USU Press, and I don't know how this is going to happen, but I felt it was so important at this AFS meeting here in Salt Lake to gather the people who were involved in this and get a record of their reminiscences and start building an oral history compendium so that some scholarly work can be done and some publishing to sort of make up for that lack. And that's why we're here today. I would like to say that tonight there's going to be a demonstration concert of the things that we will have talked about today. It's going to be at 9:30, and it's going to be right across from here in the Sun Valley Room. This concert is not on the AFS program. It was made possible at the last minute through a very generous grant from Westaff, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so we aren't, it's really there for you to know about. I may put up a little sign, but basically it's just a matter of your coming at 9:30. It's going to be a brief concert, going to end at 10:15. So it's just going to be a demonstration of some of the stuff that we talked about today. I would like to thank a lot of people for making this possible. First of all, the American Folklore Society and Tim Lloyd, who put up with my screamings for months, you know, and he helped, he really helped us shape this. He made it possible. He did a lot of stuff for us, and I just really appreciate that. Also, from the Folklore Society of Utah, Rhonda Walker Weaver was very helpful with helping me figure out what to do. Christy Young, Elaine Thatcher, all of them were very wonderful. And then there's the local staff of AF, or local volunteers, local arrangements people, Carol Edison and Craig Miller were just yo-persons in helping me put this together. It was everybody knew that it was important to do, and everybody wanted it to happen, and so it did, in spite of all kinds of scary things. The Westaff, Western States Arts Foundation, through the good offices of Elaine Thatcher, gave a small grant which made all of this come together at the last moment, and I'm very, very grateful for that. So the Folklore Society of Utah, Westaff, AFS, and all of the people connected with that are what made it possible. Of course, all these great folks who came as well, and I'm sorry that I couldn't get more of them, but they're elusive, those old folkies. And we also have a guest in the audience, Joe Hickerson, who is also an old folkie from way, way, way back. And so I expect that not only will we be talking, but there will be an opportunity for you all to speak as well if you have something to say. The format really is very simple. I'm going to talk a little bit, each of us will speak at however much length we desire, and I'll, we'll try to keep it even, more or less. But each of us will talk about this is reminiscence, this is how we got into folk music, what our experience was. And so I'm going to begin, and I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about my own experience as a member of what we later understood to be called the Urban Folk Music Revival. And I grew up in Salt Lake City. I lived in the house on 2nd Avenue, and our family moved there in the early 50s, and they're still there. My mom is still there. And when I was growing up, we had Burl Ives records in our house, and all my cousins sang them. We sang them at traveling when we went to the canyon and all this kind of thing. So Burl Ives songs were just part of our life. And we also sang rounds, and we also sang heart songs. We sang other kinds of things as well. Drink to me only with thine eyes. And we just sang all kinds of songs, but among the songs were these Burl Ives songs. And I came to realize that it was a kind of thing called folk song. And I, as a teenager, I learned how to play the guitar with chords, and so I fancied myself a bit of a folk singer. And by the time I was a senior in high school, I performed at a high school thing, and so I could sing the fox, and I could do things like that. So when in the I guess it was about that time when I became aware that the Sorrell's family lived up the street, Rosalie and Jim and their children, and so just by a very amazing coincidence, we were 2 doors down from the I guess you could call it the epicenter of the energy for this movement that happened. And Rosalie was wonderfully, she was on, I guess you could say she was my mentor, or I don't know what the right term would be, but she helped me realize that I could do this kind of work. She used to, if she had a call for somebody to come, if somebody wanted her to come give a concert and she didn't have time for it or something like that, she would call me. I was one of the people that she had a little stable of people that she would call, and I was one of them. And so I got an opportunity to be on television for the first time because of that, and I learned how to perform in a more or less professional manner under various conditions, and it was through her that became possible. I thought seriously about being a folk performer, but I guess about the late 60s, early 70s, that was when I sort of had to cross the Rubicon. It was going to be one or the other, and I thought about the very difficult life of a female folk singer particularly, and I thought, well, all things considered, maybe graduate school is a better choice. And so I stopped thinking about being a professional. But you know, Rosalie made a professional life in folk singing. So really, I was just participating in the first big concert in 1961, and I was the editor of the newsletter of the Intermountain Folk Music Society, which was founded as a way of fostering activities here in the Valley. And I just remember the tremendous excitement. I will say also that I was a member of a group called Polly and the Valley Boys, which consisted of myself and Bruce Phillips, or Utah Phillips, and Dave Roylance. And the way that came about was that Bruce and Dave had been in a group called the Utah Valley Boys, spelled B-O-Y''S, on their card. And they had been together for 2 or 3 years. There were various changes in personnel, but they had gone finally to the Galax Folk Festival in Galax, Virginia in the summer of '64. And it was a long and arduous journey. And by the time they returned, the schisms within the group were so complete that that one, two of them sort of sneaked off in the middle of the night and joined up with another bunch and formed a new group. And Bruce and Dave were sort of left out in the cold, sort of scratching their heads. And so they asked me if I would join them, and we became Polly and the Valley Boys. And this was before there was such a thing as Valley Girls, and so it did not have that connotation. And I was an honorary boy, that's right, yeah. So we had about 1.5 years or 2 years of doing some singing out, and so I had that experience as well. I learned a lot of Bruce Phillips' songs, and we did other songs as well, and we were an old-time string band. So that's my history in Salt Lake Valley on the folk music scene ends in 1966 when I left to go to graduate school. So that's really what I have to say at this point about sort of how I did it and what happened and all that kind of thing. And I'd like to just turn the stage over to Barry.
Me?
Barry
Well,
Tolkien.
I represent a somewhat earlier thread of this. I grew up in Massachusetts learning folk songs from my grandparents and my mother, and thinking that everybody in the world sang songs. I mean, they weren't just folk songs, they were sea songs, mainly sea songs, there were gay 90s songs and everything. And my 3 cousins and I sang all the time, and we had to move out of the valley we lived in because they turned it into a reservoir, and so moving out was imperative. And we moved to Springfield, and there we tried to sing outside at the playground, on the playground, and got into a fight almost every day because of singing. Because the boys in Springfield, about 30 miles away from where we grew up, boys didn't sing. And so we were proclaiming that we were something that we weren't. We were trying to show off. We were trying to do all kinds of things. And we suddenly realized that everything that we knew, that we thought was everyday songs, nobody else knew. So we quit, and we didn't sing for a long time until this Burl Ives came along. And then somebody said, that's what we should be singing. We should be singing Burl Ives songs. So we all learned Burl Ives songs and all the stuff from records instead of we had this rich repertoire from our parents and grandparents, but we'd never used it because nobody liked that kind of stuff anymore, and we sang Burl Ives songs. And all the way through school, I sang Burl Ives songs, and I even came out west and sang Burl Ives songs. And finally, there were a few more people, Harry Belafonte and others. But in 19 '65 or '64, I can't remember which. Miko and I moved from Oregon to Salt Lake City to take a job at the University of Utah. And we lived for the second year on Q Street, which was, I'm mentioning this because this is, you'll find this creepy after a while. We all lived within a couple of blocks of each other. And for no particular reason, we lived down the street, and so I got to know Rosalie, and I had met her before at a couple of things, and got to know Polly, and Polly showed up in my classes, and Bruce, I don't know, maybe he didn't live anywhere. But
Well, he did have a place down on Emerson Avenue. Yeah.
But there we were, a little community of people. I was sort of holding out for the old songs. Now I was starting to relearn them again. And here was somebody making up new songs. Here was somebody who knew both, and she knew both too, because she learned a lot from her grandfather. And we had a merry time. And I realized the difference between regional folk singing and national folk singing when Joan Baez came to town. You probably remember this. And she showed up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And she came to the door, and Rosalie answered the door, and Joan Baez looked down and said something like, "What? I wouldn't wear shoes like that," or something.
No, she didn't. She said, "Where did you get those shoes?"
Oh.
And I said, I got them at the Chuck Garden in Salt Lake City, and she didn't believe me.
So anyway, the only thing I want to say is that there are several schools of folklore, but the one here in Salt Lake that was the real, might say, it was really germane to the folklore group, folk song group, was Rosalie's house, because every year, among other things, every year at Christmas time she had a party, and people came by and could decorate the tree. There'd be a great pile of stuff there, and you could pick what you wanted and make your own decorations. I remember one time somebody decorated the tree with two balls that blinked off and on, and a brass rod of some sort with a thing at the end.
That would be Gino Sky.
Okay. And I remember one time when Bruce, I have to call him Bruce Phillips, Utah Phillips, some of you know, he was huddled over in a corner and he wouldn't let anybody see what he was doing. And it turned out he had a little figure of a man, I guess, cut out of paper. And he had it,
A child.
yeah, a child, okay, well, okay, it was a child. And then he had that surrounded by several fish.
Whales.
Yeah.
It was a child's Christmas in Wales.
Yeah. So we had, it was more than singing, it was a proto group that we experienced together, and Hal was in that, and just about everybody. But it was one of the most fetching times in my life, because I could see all sorts of folklore, from the stuff that was being made up to the stuff that was being passed on, and she was right at the middle of it. So.
That's true.
Thanks, Barry.
Well, I came from a little younger generation in the mix. In the early 60s, probably about 1961 or 1962, I went to my cousin's house, a guy named Dave Poli, and he played me records of Jesse Fuller and a record on Folkways called Mountain Music Bluegrass Style. And it was like a conversion experience for me. I was just, from then on, all I could think about was playing music, and I didn't know I found one kid at junior high named Brent Bradford, and we started a little group and sang Blue Sky Boy covers, and then we found the Intermountain Folk Music Society. I started taking guitar lessons on Saturday mornings from Jim Sorrell's at their home upstairs, and I got very involved in the Folk Music Society. But I came from a really pretty devout Mormon family, and so it was interesting. You know, by 1964, I was supporting Barry Goldwater in the election, and everyone I was hanging out with hated Barry Goldwater, and so there was this. it was an odd thing. I mean, I remember my friend Brent Bradford and I trying to find an empty bottle that sort of looked like a wine bottle, so we could drip candles and put it in the room and listen to folk music records with the lights turned low. And, so that's, you know, we had this very romantic vision when we were just teenagers about, you know, what we could be part of. And I have to say that even as 13, 14-year-olds, we were really allowed into this group in a very whole way, and it was amazing. I remember Brent Bradford was elected to the board of the Intermountain Folk Music Society. He was 14 years old, and you know, for us that was just incredible empowerment to be part of this group of people. And Rosalie always invited me to her parties when the Georgia Sea Island Singers came, or when Guy Carawan came, or when the New Lost City Ramblers came. I got to hang out with these people, and on the side I got to babysit Rosalie's children, which was a handful, I have to say.
There were 5 of them.
There were 5 of them. But it was an extraordinary experience for a young person who was sort of struggling with my religion and my faith, and at the same time just being totally compelled by this beautiful music and by a scene that I was just captivated by. I remember we'd sit, there was a coffee house that opened in town, and we didn't think we could go in, but we'd sit outside and sort of watch and wonder what was going on inside. And it was all very sort of, we were in but sort of outside of it all. When I became a sophomore in high school, at East High School, oh, by the way, Dave Poli was your classmate,
Yes,
and you had both of you had brought Jesse Fuller to high school, right?
Well, Dave brought Jesse Fuller to the campus, but he was he was a pal of mine. I really liked him a lot.
So that's,
Yeah.
I mean, there was
Yeah.
all these ties. We were all pretty close.
Yeah.
But when I was a sophomore in high school, we started the East High Folk Music Club, and Polly's younger sister Heather and a friend of mine named Ralph Dusnip and I started the club. And as sophomores, it was the largest club at East High School. It was just a gigantic club, and this was in 1964. And we put on I found this morning, a big concert.
Oh, wow.
And it included the Utah Valley Boys with Bruce Phillips and Bruce Cummings, Rosalie Sorrells, and then us kids. And I'm not sure if you sang on this concert
No.
or not, but
And many others. No,
Yeah.
I wasn't among the
many others. And here's an article with us sitting around Rosalie Sorrells, and I'll pass these around if you want to take a look at them. But we were very active in promoting folk music when we were just in high school, all sorts of different folk music. And it was a pretty exciting time for us because we really got to be involved in promoting concerts. I mean, in my later folklore work, I already knew how to put on a concert. I knew all about sound systems, and it all came from this early experience being involved as a teenager in folk music. I mean, getting Sing Out magazine and reading the latest on Pete Seeger being banned from the Hootenanny show, and there were really for me there were 2 centers of this. There was the folk music center of it, which was Rosalie's house, and then there was the bluegrass center, which was at Bruce Cummings' men's clothing store. It's in a beautiful brownstone downtown. It was called Cummings Men's Store. Beautiful clothing, and he was a little older. He was maybe older than you.
He's about 5 years old.
And he was a very fine mandolin player, and he loved bluegrass so much that we'd go down the summer of 9th grade and just play music all day. Customers would come in and want to be waited, and he'd say, wait, I just have to do this break on Rawhide. So we played music all summer at Bruce Cummings' store. And then he went off and became a vice president of Tiffany's or something, in New York. Yeah. So that's sort of my story in it. a latecomer.
Well, you developed into the Deseret String Band later on.
Later on, we
Yeah.
had the Stormy Mountain Boys in this concert. We had a group that's still going called the Stormy Mountain
Oh,
Boys
really?
with Brent Bradford. It's almost 40 or 50 years old. I'm not in it anymore. But we started the Deseret String Band and started doing Utah folk music. And some of our inspiration were Rosalie's early recordings of Utah folk music and collections, and also the Hubbard and Fife collections and Cheney collections. And we started doing old time music, but that was in the 70s, 1972 when we started. We went for about 30 years. So I'm still at it, still playing music, and I haven't changed that much.
Thanks, Hal. So, Rosalie.
I was born in Idaho, and I had a marvelous family, really an amazing family.
Where in Idaho?
Where in Idaho? I was born in St. Luke's Hospital in Boise, Idaho. And my family was very diverse and enormously literate, all of them. Very interesting people. My father's father was an Episcopal missionary who came from Culpeper, Virginia, at the turn of the century. And he came alone carrying a birch bark canoe. And I don't exactly know how he met my grandmother. She was from Quebec, and I know they met in the West. She actually came from a family that had something to do with starting the Tribune here in Salt Lake City, and they were married in Salt Lake City. But that family was into exploring the western part of the country as well, and they lived for the first quarter of the century in tents and lodges in Montana and Idaho, and Arcata, California, for some unknown reason. I can't figure out how they got that far, but they went everywhere. They went in pack trains and in boats. I have wonderful photographs of them because my grandmother was a journalist and a photographer, and she and her sister Elizabeth took photographs for stereopticons and for newspapers in the early part of the century. I have a great picture of my great-grandmother and three of the sisters, my grandmothers, and because she took the photograph. And all of them in Stanley Basin, Idaho, there's not anyone for 500 miles in any direction, but they are all dressed to the nines with hats and gloves. And there's a baby carriage sitting there in the midst of all that wilderness. And I thought, what could have possessed them to dress like that in this wild place? And my mother's father came from Ironton, Ohio. He was very Irish. His name was James Madison Kelly. And he was an adventurer. He fought in the Spanish-American War. He went to Alaska in the Gold Rush. And his wife was a Methodist from West Virginia. She was a head nurse at the Christ Hospital there. Not too many years ago, when I went to sing at the Mountain Stage concert stage in West Virginia, a whole lot of people I didn't even know existed showed up with many photographs of my grandmother when she was a young woman and a nurse, with her hair all piled up in 3 tiers and a little absurd 20 times folded nurse's cap on top of the whole arrangement. And I just love that. I know those people were there. And in any case, they all ended up being in Idaho. My mother's family had a self-sufficient farm in Twin Falls, which we all know is an oxymoron. And my grandmother and grandfather bought this piece of land, which I now live on. The year I was born, I'm 71. And I live in a handmade cabin that my father cut all the logs for and made all the bricks for. And I have a really great continuum through this family. All of the music that I know from my family came from living. I never thought of it as being anything except part of life. And I actually know how to make butter in a churn, and like Jean Ritchie, I knew the little come butter come butter come. I knew how to make everything. We didn't have any money, so we had to know how to make everything. And before I went to school, I think I knew 12 mythologies because my mother and my father thought that was important. And I knew how to read, thank God, before I went to school, or they would have probably ruined my ability to read. But by suggesting that I read something about Dick and Jane instead of Harun al-Rashid, who I was very attracted to. And so I had all of that music in me before I began to listen to Burl Ives. You know, Burl Ives was a favorite of my mother and father, Joseph Murray and Miranda. We listened to that, but we also listened to Biddu Sayao and Jussi Björling. We listened to everything. I wanted to be an opera singer. I didn't want to be a folk singer. I never had the equipment to be an opera singer, but I can still sing part of the prologue to Pagliacci because my father sang it all the time, and I have no idea what it means, but I know. Un nido di memorie in fondo l'anima triveccio un giorno. How could you forget that? And we sang art songs, we sang every kind of song. And I got read to or sung to every night of my life. Everyone loved Shakespeare, everyone loved Edgar Guest. You know, it's just this amazing hodgepodge of stuff went into my head. Bruce Phillips once said my head was like an attic. Everything's in there, but you can't find it. Unless you really dig. And it would be impossible for me to put into a capsule how I got into this, but the main influences were, I married way too young and had 5 children, and came to Salt Lake when my husband who worked for the telephone company, was transferred here, and I got into the extension division. I took a class. I played the ukulele then. So did Bruce Phillips. When we met, we both played the ukulele. We played it, little one, and I played an alto. And we used to get together and with a whole lot of other people and sing everything. And he made up calypso songs. He'd kill me if I sang you those, but I still remember them. And the name of the little coffee house was The Abyss. It was under the Capitol Theater. And it was closed for a while by a sheriff who thought it was too dark in there, and there were too many weird-looking people who looked like something called beatniks that were appearing. And when it opened again, they couldn't figure out what to call it. I suggested Son of Abyss, but they wouldn't. In any case, I began to take a class called folk songs, accompaniment or something like that. And Dean Harold Bentley, he really was one of the great savers of my life. He bought me a guitar, a real guitar. It was a favilla, and you could actually hold the strings down. In the guitar classes, he believed that if everyone in the world played the guitar, there would be no more war, pestilence, or famine, or any unpleasantness at all. And eventually I taught that class along with my husband, and we had 4 classes that had at least 20 to 25 students. And then I taught a children's class on Saturday mornings, which I really hated because they thought it should be outside, and the children would bring me birds and worms and interesting bugs. out of that came this folk music society that we're talking about. But somewhere he gave me, I had no instruction at all. I didn't know how to play the guitar. I still don't really know how to play the guitar. But he gave me lessons with Bill Fowler, who was a marvelous classical guitar player. I don't know if any of you would remember him. He'd studied with Segovia, and he used to bring Segovia here. I got to see him 4 times here. And he also brought Charlie Bird, the great jazz guitarist. And I was a jazz freak. That was my drug of choice music-wise then, you know. But I began to hear all of this other stuff, and one summer he brought Wayland Hand from UCLA, and Wayland Hand taught a class called An Introduction to American Folk Music. And he introduced me to the concept of oral transmission, how a song can last for centuries and change all of the characters, the tune, the words, the sex of the protagonist in the song, and still be precisely the same song. And you can see it. And he knew the song he chose to show us this with was The Streets of Laredo. And he had 1,000 versions of this. And he showed us how it started off as the unfortunate rake and brought it up through to the 20th century. And I said, oh, I know one of those. That's the first album I was ever on. It's an album from Folkways called The Unfortunate Rake. It is a fascinating piece of work, and everyone should hear it. It has Ewan McCall and A.L. Lloyd on it, and it has Dave Van Ronk and Margaret Berry on it. It has Rosalie Sorrells on it.
Even has Jan Brunvand.
It has, and it has Alan Lomax. I mean, it is really wonderful, and it goes up through all of that. And I was so extraordinarily overtaken by this sense of continuum in these songs. And then he sent me to a seminar at UCLA, where he was, he was a professor emeritus there. That's a really great place. They have the best library I've ever seen. And I got to stay 3 weeks, and the personnel who taught at this were Charles Seeger and Bess Lomax Hawes. This was in 1957, I think.
59.
No, it can't be, because I made that album in 58, and it was after I went to that.
Okay, sorry, I'm usually right.
If you want to find it, I have an archive, and you can see all of these things if you want to go there, and it's a really nice place to go. It's the University of California at Santa Cruz in the special collections. And I have all of those things with dates on them.
Good.
But I can't remember them very well. I just know that we moved down here. It might have been 58 when I went to the seminar. It was the year that Shelley was born, and if I sat here and subtracted how old she is from this this date, I'd know. Anyway, John Greenway was there. Charles Seeger, as I said, Herbert Halpert, Bess Hawes, Ed Cray, who was then just a young person who was D.K. Wilgus' assistant. He has just written a marvelous book about Woody Guthrie. I think everybody should read. And my guide was Guy Carawan, who took me all around Los Angeles and introduced me to all the Bud and Trav and Cynthia Gooding and all the people who were then singing in the Ash Grove and all around town. And there were people who came and demonstrated the music they were talking about. Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee came, and it was just, I can't describe to you what it did to me. I just immediately started reading tomes, libraries of Malcolm Laws and Vance Randolph and James Francis Child and all of the, I was particularly taken by the protest songs, which and John Greenway and I became great friends. And I brought a lot of those people up here. When I came back, Dean Bentley made the facilities of the University of Utah available to me. That's how eventually that Intermountain Folk Music Society came to be. But he let me bring people. I never thought I'd go anywhere. I had 5 children, a great big house. I didn't expect to go out of Utah, except for maybe a visit to California, which is close enough. But I brought Guy first. That was interesting. He and Peggy Seeger and a bunch of people had gone to Red China. They'd gone to Russia first. Now that was in '58.
Was it?
They'd gone to they'd gone to Russia for an international youth conference, and they were the only country. This was the only country in the United States or in the world. The United States was the only country in the world that didn't fund a delegation to that international youth conference, and they were already in trouble when they got there, but then they went to Red China. Red China invited them, and the State Department said, you can't go there, or we won't okay your passport for that. And they said, well, the Red Chinese said, well, they don't recognize us anyhow, you don't need a passport, and they went. And they went everywhere in China and took pictures. And so Guy brought 7 hours of pictures and a film about this International Youth Conference. And it was the most amazing stuff I ever saw, and I only got about 7 people to come. Everyone was just undone about it being Red China, so they didn't have anything to do with it. It was the least successful thing I ever did in terms of an audience, but it was really an eye-opener. I then brought Gene Ritchie for we put on a small festival, and we got people. I remember getting that man. Oh God, I can't. There's a 10-inch album for Folklore. What was his name? He was from Ogden, and he sang Zack the Morning Pioneer. And when he whistled, woo, woo.
Wasn't that Lester Hubbard?
My mama'd understand. He's about an engineer who had a wife in every town. No.
Myron Crandall?
No, Fred something.
Fred Keller?
I'm sorry, I can't remember that. It just suddenly popped into my head. I remember him because he, and when he whistled, woo, woo, he's go. And some of the other people, there were some kids from BYU who did polygamy dances. There'd be three women and one man. And of course, they were really Swedish dances that had nothing to do with polygamy, but they called them polygamy dances. And Austin Fife, I met Austin Fife and Hector Lee and all those people, and we hadn't started that Intermountain Folk Music Society yet. It was just the Folklore Society and the Extension Division were really paying for this, but they allowed us to have sometimes Kingsbury Hall, if it was somebody really well known, or this smaller theater in the Round, or the ballroom, and the more we began to see how many people would like to come. People loved coming here, so on the way to everywhere, and they could make some money going from here to there. And I would always put the concerts on Wednesday because I found that anybody would come on Wednesday. They were going to be from Denver to San Francisco, And I began to have big meetings in my house every Friday night, just for us to all sing. And the Utah Valley Boys would come, and everybody would come. And I had hooked up with some very interesting people who had one of the better poetry magazines from the 50s called Wild Dog. It was Gino Sky and Drew Wagnon. So all of those people were coming through town, and I personally think that was one of the things that made it most interesting, was that conjunction between the folk music people and the poets. Charles Olson came, and Edward Dorn started that magazine up in Idaho, at the University of Idaho State University of Pocatello. And these were students of his, and there was this Barry, the theater guy, the theater dance guy. There was
Barry Lynn.
Barry Lynn.
Yeah.
There was a marvelous underground here of theater, poetry, folk music, and political people, including Ammon Hennessy, and that all came together to make this into one of the more interesting places in the United States, underground. And this is a very good university. The people who were in the university all understood how interesting that was, and how important it was that all these people were meeting together through the offices of those very interesting people who were here. It just didn't ever get any publicity. Yesterday I went to a publicity panel, and all the people who paid attention to us were people we simply went and dragged by the hair of the head, kicking and screaming. And I believe when it finally became a thing where we could raise money and bring people that were important to us, like Jean Ritchie. Jean Ritchie really influenced my life. She got me onto the Newport Folk Festival after she met me there. And Waylon was interested in the stuff from my family and the things that I knew, just that I had never thought of as being interesting to anyone. So in the South, sometimes they call them those old throwed away songs. And I just also would say that because it was the 60s when I finally became aware of what I was involved in, there was a generous countrywide connection. Everyone was connected. Everyone knew about each other. There was I think that's what's wrong with everything now, is no one's connected anymore. Everybody's afraid of each other. And at that time, there was a possibility, a window where everyone connected. And I was able to be a part of that. I was the person who did that. Now, when I became a professional, it's because I left my husband and I had to support 5 children, and I didn't know how to do anything. And that's why I became a folk singer. I do not think of myself as a folk singer. I'm a storyteller who uses music to advance the story. I'm a troubadour. I brought the news from one person to another. We all did. And that's what my story is.
Thanks, Rosalie.
Yeah.
I wonder if this might be a time to just open the floor for anybody that might have some memories from that same period or anything of that sort. You don't have to have been from Salt Lake to be able to talk about this, because what Rosalie's describing was happening all over the country. I think that Rosalie is extraordinary in that she was an impresario who made connections everywhere she went, and she remembered. I can remember talking with Rosalie talking to me. I would be coming home from the university and walking past Rosalie's house, and Rosalie would tap on that window and say, "Come on in," So I'd come in, she'd give me some coffee, and then she would tell me things about what was going on in the world of the people that she knew. And she would tell me about books and things like that as well. But what I understood was that Rosalie was a great connector of people. And there were other things going on in the country at the same time. And I wonder if there are people here who would like to speak about what was going on in their own memory or anything. Yeah, Peggy?
Well,
I just, my first memory of Rosalie was 1963, I think, at Cafe Lena in Saratoga, because I was born and raised in Albany, part of that whole pickin' and singing gathering, which was another whole thing that was happening on the East Coast. Bill and Andy Spence and Richard and Lee Wilkie and the Beers family were all creating a network of people who could come together and just share music and enjoy music, and you didn't have to know anything about it. You could just come and enjoy. And I remember you came with Utah Phillips, and we were just so intrigued that these Western people, I mean, we had never, seen, a real, Utah Phillips, a real cowboy, it was just an amazing performance you did. I mean, I still remember it to this day.
Clad from head to toe in leather.
Yes!
With the hair already.
I mean,
Looking
you
like Mark
fulfilled
Twain.
all of our expectations.
We called
And
him Utah Leather Freak then.
but it was great because this whole East Coast crowd would got a taste of what was happening out west, which was it was a whole different thing.
You have to really give Lena more credit though, because she
Yes.
she did not only, I mean, she was amazing with her connection to traditional music, but she knew. She's the first person who ever put Arlo Guthrie on. She's the first person who ever put Bob Dylan on
Yep.
in a coffee house in the state of New York.
Right.
She brought everybody. She loved theater. She brought theater. She brought jazz musicians. I saw Bucky Pizzarelli and Joe Venuti used to come up there all the time and play. I mean, it was an amazing. Again, there's Yaddo and the university and Bill Kennedy, whose influence just stretches so hugely there.
Okay, just wanted to say, the person who just spoke for the record is Peggy Bulger. So when you speak, would you just give your name as well? Yeah,
Okay, I'm Allie Dodson from Salt Lake City.
thank you.
During this period of time, I was living in Kentucky for quite a while. Back in the 40s, I was introduced to folk music via public school music, the rather butchered versions of the traditional music that appeared in the school songbooks. And I went to the laboratory school at Western Kentucky. My dad was a professor of chemistry there. So I went through the laboratory school and on and graduated from Western. This was a state teachers college at that time. But, and then when I was in Girl Scouts, I learned more songs. That's what we sang at day camp, and that's what we sang at camp. Well, I went to the camp at Owensboro. And then when I was started in 7th grade and up, I went to Methodist camp. Well, we sang folk songs, traditional folk songs, well, versions of them, I should say. It really got interesting when we learned two versions of the same song. Like the God said to Noah, there's going to be a floody, floody. Well, we had two versions of that. And I kept a notebook in which I wrote down all the verses to all these things. So I still have that to some of these songs that I added to over the time. So I could remember them. I couldn't remember all those verses otherwise. But then I went, when I was in college, the year I graduated was 1961. D.K. Wilgus was there at that time. I knew him, and I spent one summer working for him, typing up little things for his files, things the students submitted. And I learned that he had another file at home that nobody at the school saw. That was where all the obscene things went.
The Delta file.
Delta file, yes.
The man I mentioned, Ed Cray, who was his assistant, has written a very good book called The Erotic Muse, which is all about dirty folk songs.
I think I came across a few of those that he'd forgotten to weed out before I got to them. But I was typing them on the old-fashioned typewriter. And I went to graduate school at the University of Arkansas. I was an English major there, too. But one of my professors, a woman, had assigned me to write a paper or do an oral presentation on Robert Burns. And she provided me with a copy of a thoroughly obscene publication called The Merry Muses of Caledonia, which I was using in that. I added some words to my vocabulary, too, by the way.
Did you meet Mary Celestia Parler? Was she a teacher of yours?
I don't remember. It was 17th century literature was what it is, English literature. I was just in the English department there.
Yeah.
It was a woman, I know it was a woman, otherwise she wouldn't have dared to do that, I don't
I
think.
don't think so.
She chose me for that project because my last name was Dooley, and she said that was close enough. Anyway, it was the closest name to well, Dooley's Irish, Scottish, or whatever. But, because my Dooleys were Scotch-Irish. But, this was also an oral presentation, so I was trying to sing some of those tunes, and I did a little bit of study on the melodies, which were extremely difficult to sight read. Just had a pitch pipe was all I had to do with it. I did a music minor in college, so I had some idea of what I was doing. But I found the range was very extreme for me, and some of the intervals were very unusual, and it took me a while to learn to sing them. But there was a copy in the library that had some of these songs in it. But then I went, after that I taught school for 6 years, both secondary and two years on a college level. I was at Campbellsville, Kentucky 1 year with Dr. Montel, was the dean there for that particular year, and I got hold of his book that he wrote on a multicultural community. I don't remember the name of it now, but
The Saga of Poe Ridge.
yeah, Poe Ridge. And then I moved to Idaho. Well, I moved to Utah, at Logan. I taught freshman English at Logan 1 year, and I was pregnant that year and very sick. My husband was going to school there, and then we went to Pocatello, Idaho after that. Well, I had continued with the music I learned. I had all of my contacts were secondary at that point. Sometime in Pocatello, I ran across Rosalie. She came and did a presentation at a coffee shop somewhere, and her Sing Out magazine had her picture on the front of it. That's what I remember. I
No,
started,
they never put me on the front of that magazine.
something about Faith Baldwin or something was in there too. And the last year I was in Pocatello, Idaho, I got involved with the international folk dancing, so I've taken up folk dancing as well. I do that here at Salt Lake, several different varieties thereof. But I moved to Salt Lake in '88. I've been here since. But I have continued with my folk songs. I remember I sang for you one time when you were collecting the kinds of songs I sang, though you never did get in your book, but I enjoyed singing anyway. I sang the music I sang to my children. My baby rocking song was not a baby rocking song. It was the Cherry Tree, the Riddle song. And I
Gave my love to Cherry.
yeah, that one. And I used some of the counting songs and the color songs I taught to my children. I dug up out of the folk music, Will You Wear Red, Jenny Jenkins for colors, and the 10 Little Indians, I think, only we didn't do count Indians. It's not appropriate it's an ethnic slur, so we counted everything else except Indians, chairs and dogs and whatever, but I made use of them. One of my fond memories of my children was a mime that they did spontaneously to an Irish song. My dad had played classical music all the way through, but he discovered recorded folk music from various places in Europe, so I had that influence too. But this was an Irish song, and there are versions of it in America about this young man who's proposing to the girl, and she won't have him because he's got some bad habits. And one of them was the boy sitting up on the back of the chair, their arms folded in a grim look, looking down at the girl was looking down at the boy who was on his knees, proposing, and they were acting this out as the record was playing, and it was amazing.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, Dave.
In the early
Dave
60s,
Stanley.
I was, Dave Stanley from Salt Lake. In the early 60s, I was in college in New Jersey, and as I went through college, I started spending more and more time in New York and less time in New Jersey. And the Greenwich Village coffee house scene was really pretty amazing in the early 60s, particularly every Sunday afternoon when the weather was decent. People would gather at Washington Square Park in the middle of Greenwich Village, and sort of similar to what Hal was describing in terms of the welcoming atmosphere in which kids, early high school, even junior high, were welcomed as part of that singing community. all of these kids from the suburbs and from the far boroughs of New York City would come in on the subway and gather at Washington Square and listen to, you know, some people had made 8 or 10 records, some people were just getting started, and some people were 14 years old. But that welcoming atmosphere was also reflected in the coffee house scene that was going on then, because of course coffee houses didn't serve alcohol, and therefore kids as young as 13 or 14 were welcome to come in and were exposed to the folk music scene and what was left over of the beat generation as well.
Exactly, it was right there.
With
then.
oral poetry and jazz and so on. I had grown up near Washington, D.C. when the only music in town was Charlie Bird and Ramsey Lewis at the Bohemian Caverns. That was it. There was no bluegrass scene, there was no folk music, nothing. But by the time I got into my last couple of years of college, there were some coffee houses springing up. Washington was always very late compared to the rest of the East Coast. And I wound up working as a waiter in the Ontario Place Coffee House, where the featured performers were Mississippi John Hurt and Liva Cotton.
Oh, that's right.
It's not bad.
And again, kids coming in from the suburbs. In those days, you could get a driver's license when you were 15, and so all of these kids from the suburbs were sitting at the feet of these great masters and really becoming a part of that scene.
Thanks, Dave. Lonnie, would you like to talk about your experience?
What?
Well, you're a fiddle player and a musicologist.
Well,
Lonnie Herman.
I went to college at the University of Chicago from Hawaii,
Oh.
and that was an experience. And snow, you know, all those cultural things that you had to, but there was a University of Chicago Folk Festival about a year and a half after I got there, and there was this folk music club. I forget what it was. This group of people who got together and sang, and they called those wingdings. And then they had hootenannies, which were performances. And then somehow the New Lost City Ramblers got together with some of the people, the organizers of, I think it was called the Folk Music Society. The UFC.
Was it the Old Town crowd?
No, it was
Earlier than
the,
that.
the UFC Folk Music
Mhm.
Club. And they put on this series of concerts in the middle of the winter, I believe. Like February, when there was nothing else going on. The first one, the Stanley Brothers were there,
Oh, great.
and Ralph, they got partied up to the point where, like, yeah.
That's a 4
At
o'clock.
the second or third concert, they lost their bass player because he was just not able to play anymore.
Oh, dear.
So one of the Ramblers played bass. But there was this little old guy named Horton Barker.
Oh, God, was he wonderful.
He stood there on stage and sang these ballads and blew everybody away. And Ralph
Texas
Stanley.
Gladden was a cousin of Texas Gladden was a cousin of his.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And Ralph Stanley unbuttoned so far as to play Frail his banjo.
Love a good frailer.
Anyway,
Okay. Well, thanks. Appreciate that. Anybody else want to talk about any of their memories from those days? Because there is some other stuff I want to do, but I'd love to give everybody a chance to speak. Well, I think it might be nice to turn back to the the music scene had already begun. Anyway, Barry, would you like to talk about any of the collecting that you did?
I didn't do too much collecting. One thing I do remember though was collecting a version, this is before I moved, this is when I was here as a student. I went south to Blanding with some friends of mine, and it ended up in a two-year trip of prospecting for uranium. But anyway, I met a guy down there, an old man. Well, I remembered his name this morning. Maybe his name will come to me. He was a resident of Blanding, who said, "I'll sing you a song if you don't tell anybody who sang it for you." And I said, "Well, I'm not accustomed to this sort of thing. I always knew it." And I said, "We're supposed to give the name and address and the age and all that stuff." And he said, "No, you can't have the song then." And I said, "Well, of the choice, I guess I'll take the song and I'll negotiate later." He said, "You can do anything you want with the song, just don't associate me with it." And then he sang me the Mountain Meadows Massacre Ballads, which is one of the best versions of the Mountain Meadows Massacre Ballad I ever heard, and became the first article I ever wrote. But he died, and I wasn't able to use his name ever. And it was because he was afraid in Blanding, a small town that was divided several ways by folks who had, what do they call them? No, the people that had come from Bluff, that had come through the hole in the rock.
Oh, yeah.
And they were about 3 different Mormon groups, and each group had a different scenario for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And at that time, by the way, before the 1950s, it was to outsiders like myself, it was said that Mountain Meadows Massacre never happened. It was a dirty rumor spread by Gentiles. And yet, every once in a while, out from under the rocks would creep somebody who knew something about it. And he was an old guy, and he had the idea that this would die with him. And so he wanted to sing the ballad, but he still couldn't let his name be known. He lived in a small town, and he would suffer for it. So that became my first ballad. My first article was the Mountain Meadows Massacre Ballad. And speaking of whoever it was, I guess several of us spoke of Waylon Hand. It was Waylon Hand's cajoling that got me publishing it in Western Folklore. I mean, Waylon Hand was active in everybody's life. I don't know. I don't think he slept at night even. He just wrote to everybody. I mean, you find a spare line in something that he thought you'd understand or like, and he'd write you a letter. And so he published that article on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. It's a note in Western Folklore about 1959, if you're interested.
That's cool. I guess Waylon could be called the impresario
Yeah.
of the publishing end of things. So, Hal, how about you?
Well, again, it was a little later for me. I heard Utah folk songs. I came from a family who was very involved in music. My grandmother and her sisters played at the old Salt Lake Theater, played guitars and played light classical music. But we grew up singing songs in our family as well. And but I'd never heard folk songs from Utah. I'd heard Rosalie sing them, and then in college at the University of Utah, I used to skip class and go up to special collections, and they'd let me play the original Hubbard recordings on acetate. And I just love those original recordings of his. And I started learning some of the songs, and started a group called the Deseret String Band, and we learned a lot of the songs from the Hubbard collection particularly. And Alan Jabor, who I'd met through fiddling circles when I was in graduate school in Rhode Island, was just hired at the National Endowment for the Arts, and so we made a grant. Tom Carter, who I played music with and still do, and Jan Brunvon was sort of he was part of the grant application, because we didn't think as young kids we could ever qualify for a grant, but he was willing to sign his name to it. And we asked for a grant to publish something called the New Beehive Songster, 2 volumes of it. One were the original recordings, some of the best of what Hubbard and Fife had recorded. And then we published those as a 12-inch LP. And then in the bicentennial year, with NEA funding, I went out and tried to find a second generation of music. And I really started by going to some of the same families that Hubbard and Fife had collected from in the 30s and 40s. And I found that there was only a couple of people left alive in 76, 75, that they'd recorded. Myron Crandall from Ogden, Otho Murphy from Moab. But I recorded them, but I also went to some of the best people that really knew a lot of songs and found that their kids and grandkids were also singers. And I recorded sort of a second generation. We put out a second volume called The New Beehive Songster Volume 2 that were all recordings that I'd made pretty much, traveling around on the bicentennial year. And then we put the album out and unfortunately credited the National Endowment for the Humanities for the grant.
Oh, no.
And Alan said, "This is a great record, but I can't show it to anyone because you got the money from the National Endowment for the Arts," and we had no idea there was a difference. So it was a little embarrassing.
Yeah, I guess so.
Oh, boy. Yeah, and you go and ask people for money and you make that mistake. It's really amazing what happens. People get so hanky about it.
Rosalie, I can remember one time you gave a concert, or maybe you were just talking about this, but it was about a particular song, which you will know very well. You said that the woman who sang it to you, because you were collecting folk songs, and I guess it was in the late 50s, you said the woman who sang it to you had a kind of a practiced and mannered sort of concert style of
It was a
performance.
very Victorian
Yes, yes.
way of delivering it. She played the piano.
Mhm.
The song is The Lonesome Roving
Yeah.
Wolves, and I think it's one of the best American folk songs. We used to call those Native American folk songs, and everybody thinks you're talking about Indians, but we were talking about songs that were native to America. And I still think it's a really great song. When I sang it, I was very much influenced in my singing by Gene Ritchie and Hallie Wood, both of whom became good friends of mine. And I'm Irish through and through, and I listen to a lot of Irish traditional songs, and it naturally fell into that Sean No style of singing. I always sang it unaccompanied, and I naturally changed that tune from a major to a minor. I'll sing a little of it for you. It's a gorgeous song. The Mormons were camped down by the green grove, where the clear waters flow from the mountains above. The wind it approached, all chilly and cold, and we listened to the howling of those lonesome roving wolves, and the groans of the dying were heard in our camp, and the cold chilly frost was seen on our tent, and the fear in our hearts can never be told. And we listen to the howling of those lonesome roving wolves. I sang that one night at the Lion's Head in New York City in the company of some of the best in the world, and one of them was Joe Heaney, and he pounded on the table and yelled, "Fine girl you are." Most important compliment I have ever gotten in my life.
I think it's important to note that what happened in Utah is that these traditional songs, such as the Lonesome Roving Wolves, was transformed or was transmogrified into a Victorian parlor piece by the woman who had
Yeah.
had it.
She learned it and from her father,
Yeah.
who probably sang it the way I sang it.
Yeah,
In fact, when she heard me sing it, she said, "Oh, that sounds a lot more like the way he sang it," because she had learned piano chords to play with it, and she had learned to sing in school, and she learned that. I couldn't even reproduce the way she sang it now. It doesn't translate into my understanding of how you sing a song like that.
But you're saying that was in, that she sang it in a major key?
Yes, she did. Or she didn't, that's a modal key. It really is, I don't remember which modal it is.
But you were out,
Dorian, probably.
Probably Dorian, yeah.
you were out in places like Bountiful and Layton, and you called them flowered hats, but it was ladies' clubs that you would visit and share your knowledge, and then they would sing
Yeah.
you.
I actually learned how to collect from really great collectors. That seminar that I went to was some of the best collectors in the world. Herbert Halpert was the last of the really great ones that you could get to well in Austin. But what I learned was you have to listen and not interject your own ideas or anything, and then you're very likely to find out all kinds of really great things that you would never find any other way. But I used a lot of technique. I got on cooking programs on television, local cooking programs, and I talked about my grandmother making Bubble and Squeak and Tipsy Charlotte, and then I would sing a couple of songs, and people would call me up and they would ask me to come and sing, and I went round to I sang for the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers a lot, and I remember one time this woman came up and said, "Sing that song about Brigham Young." And it's a scurrilous song about Brigham Young, and I thought I probably shouldn't because it would offend everyone, and so I said, I don't think I can remember that. And she said, "I know you know it. It's on your record." And I said, "Oh, well, I just didn't want to offend anyone." And she said, "Oh, we all know that song." I went to singing it, and they all did sing it with me.
David Stanley, you had a comment.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Barry about his performing career, because I know you put out a record on Prestige maybe in the early 60s.
And I still have it.
So do I. You still have it. Called Acres of Clams, but a lot of the songs on that record you collected yourself around the Northwest, I think. Did you have a professional performing career?
Yeah, for a while, but I was mostly in academia, so I wasn't free to go around the way she was.
We did concerts together.
Yeah,
though.
we did concerts together. We did a lot of things. But I did collecting. I'd run into somebody who knew a song and I'd collect it. I didn't do any lengthy collecting, but I just collected songs that I knew of. And in fact, one beautiful day, I thought it was beautiful, was where I saw the origin of a folk song. I don't know if you remember that. Rosalie came to my house. We lived in Eugene, Oregon
I
at the
remember
time.
perfectly.
And I don't know how many kids, about 10 of your kids were here.
Five kids.
And she came wheeling in, and she was to do a concert or something the next day. And her kids had been, all day they'd been complaining about something, and one was, "I'm going to tell about this," and one was, "I'm going to tell about that," and she had started a chant, but "I'm going to tell," that's all I ever hear you kids say is "I'm going to tell." By the time she got up off in our house, she says, "We've got a song to sing you," and she had converted the kids from murder, I guess, to make a song. And they had a song, as I
He
remember.
let Sweeney Todd the barber before that.
Yeah. And they had two verses of it, and my kids sang it the following summer
At Fox Hollow.
at Fox Hollow. That's where I met you. And
I couldn't believe it had traveled all the way across the country.
and they had a
And I
third
heard it
they had a third verse that I didn't even know of at the time that my kids had made up. And since that time, we've heard it from people from all over the world. People have heard it in Ireland and in India and
The The Pinewood Society for Folk Music Society sent me 14 dirty verses to it. Aren't very good, but you know your song is a folk song when people make up dirty verses to it. I sang a lot in prisons, and they loved it. They used to send me verses all the time. They really think it's pretty funny. I'm going to
Yeah.
tell on you.
That's great.
Oh, yes.
Uh,
What's your name?
yeah, Reverend.
Ed Rever? Yeah.
A question, and then maybe just a brief comment. I had a student down at Dixie who collected the song "The Apostate's Dream," and I don't know that I've ever seen that in print. Is that one that?
Oh, I've never heard.
I don't know that song.
How does it go?
Well, that's the second part. Is that I cannot sing.
Oh.
It starts out as I lay slumbering, all curled up in a heap, and then dreams about going to hell, and the saints by thousands come pouring in, and then describe some of them specifically, bring them in, and others. I'll have to get that.
Yeah.
I'd love to sing that.
That's wonderful.
The other thing, maybe just a story when you mentioned the riddle song. I grew up totally opposite from the kinds of experiences you're talking about in a little town of Littlefield, Arizona, a town of 30, and there was no music, and radio, TV didn't reach down in there, and I remember my mother singing maybe one song. Just stay in your own backyard, don't go.
Oh, yes,
further away.
yeah, that's right. Stay in your own backyard.
We asked her to sing, and actually recorded that a while back, but it has the pickaninny word in it, so
That's
we're
right.
not quite sure if we can tell it to anybody else.
It was very well known.
Yeah. And that's the only song I think I remember from my childhood. I took Barry Tolkien's class, 65, 66, we figured out somewhere in there.
We were probably in the same class at Utah. Yeah,
When
65,
you were at the
yeah.
University of Utah.
Yeah.
To that, I heard Rosalie and Joan Baez and Gene Ritchie came, and it was a wonderful experience. And then I was drafted, and in '69 and '70, I ended up in Vietnam, and I was an infantry soldier, but I was back taking the place of a company clerk who was on R&R. There was a little base library, and I went down there sometimes. And I ended up there at closing time, and everybody left except for about 40 black soldiers and me. And they apparently knew what was going to happen, and I didn't. But after everybody else had left, they formed a big circle with the chairs, got a mic and a little amp there. And they passed the mic around and sang. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences. All of them sad, mournful songs of back home. There were, we'd cry and sing. And they passed it to me, and I said, well, I don't sing. And they said, oh, you got to sing. So I said, well, okay. And I sang the riddle song. And it was horrible. I just cannot sing. But it was the most strange experience because I was the incompetent. I was the child among masters. And as we left, dozens of them came over, patted me on the back, good job, great job. And it was a very moving experience for me. But that all came from acquaintance with you.
That's a beautiful story, Ed, and it kind of illustrates that kind of camaraderie and welcomingness and acceptingness that was that's something that Rosalie first mentioned, that, or I guess Hal, really, that just everybody in that era or in that ambience is open and accepting.
Well, that kind of music is meant, this kind of music altogether is meant to include people rather than to exclude people. And it's a different direction that it moves. And insofar as it moves away from that and gets to the entertainer, then you've lost folk song somehow.
When I was collecting in the 70s doing the Beehive Songsters, by that time it was really interesting because I remember going to people's homes and saying, do you know folk songs? And they say, no, I don't know folk songs because folk song had this commercial meaning, I don't do any Peter, Paul and Mary, I don't do any Kingston Trio, and yet these people knew piles of songs, but they didn't think of them as folk songs anymore, and so in a way it sort of turned into exclusionary in it. And I don't think it's from the scene that we're talking about. It was from some other
No,
part of it
certainly
that we didn't.
We resisted
prescribed
that.
Oh, I know. I remember
Lower
picketing
height.
at Skyline High School because they didn't have any. All they had was commercial folk music on the
You
their-
picketed?
yeah,
Ah.
with Mark Richmond. Yeah.
Oh, that's
That's
great. Well,
great.
this kind of brings up a thing that we might, we have a little bit of time left, but it might be good to talk about this concept of the name, the urban folk music revival, because this is something that is coming from, I believe, a layer of political, socio-political history, which is about left-wing politics. And I don't think there was any such thing among in the singing traditions of Utah and Idaho. That wasn't going on at all. And so what we have is people who, well, what I'm thinking is, no, I'm thinking they're, well, not the Mormon ladies anyway.
I got fired for singing from a radio program I was on for singing and talking atomic blues.
I know that. I didn't explain it right. Yeah, what I'm saying is there were people who were politically aware, who were in tune with that political, social protest tradition. But it seems to me that it's, I don't know, maybe somebody who's a historian of this could talk about this better, but it seems to me that it was a misnomer to call it an urban folk revival, because it was a vival. It was already here, and I'm just thinking this up as I go along. It seems to me there were several layers of performance and text and stuff like that going on, because there were people that Hal knew, the ranchers and all that, and all of you collected from folks like that. But everybody who was doing that collecting was coming from a perspective of knowledge of this larger movement, which came to be known as the urban folk music revival. So I guess I'm a little confused about, well, how do you feel about that? Yeah.
I think perhaps you did not participate in the larger picture that I'm talking about, really, because did you ever meet Am and Hennessy or go?
I did, yeah, I did meet
They
Ammon,
were.
yeah.
Did you go to those meetings? They were using that music. They all knew all that music, and they were using it to make new music. And that's my understanding of the urban music, folk music revival.
And it fits in beautifully with
Yeah.
stuff that I'm aware of from elsewhere. Yeah, that's right. So but see, that's different from the farmers.
I would like to say that I believe. That was all going on in my. I was raised in a very political family.
Yeah.
My father lost his job because he supported Henry Wallace, and I heard all of that music as well. My uncles were card-carrying members of the Communist Party, and I know an immense body of music that was going on in the 30s and the 40s,
Right.
and way before that, and they were using this music to advance those ideas. But Bruce Phillips is the one who really got a hold of that and used the old songs to make new songs, and used and was. He certainly wasn't the first person I met who used that music by any stretch of the imagination. I knew it in the 40s from my uncles, but he's the one who has brought it forward. One great song he wrote in memory of Woody Guthrie, is "Ashes on the Sea," and that almost states it. If you'd like, I could sing it.
Sure,
just,
yeah.
Just to give you an idea of this.
Let me get it.
Okay. I just thought of that as a quick. What is this song I hear repeating, sprung from the careless seeds you've sown? Our songs will come and go like seasons, their bloom and fade all on their own. Now I know I cannot find you. You're gone from all but memory. to turn and look on my own face. What is that shadow just behind me? Why, it's the old one I reach out to embrace. It's one thing to look upon a picture, it's another thing to read the pages through, or perhaps to linger by the wayside, hoping I might find a trace of you. And now I know I cannot find you from all but memory. And I am told that one who loves you strewed your ashes on the sea. The dust clouds still blow across your footprints. Your best friend still stands there all alone. Boxcars still keep the lovers parting. Little boys still run away from home. What is this song you hear repeating, sprung from the careless seeds I've sown? Our songs will come and go like seasons. They'll bloom and fade all on their own. And now I know I cannot find you. Gone, gone from all but memory. And I am told that one who loves you strewed your ashes on the sea. I'm told that one who loves you strewed your ashes on the sea.
Thanks, Rose.
See, the way it starts says, what is this song I hear repeating, sprung from the careless seeds you sown? And then it ends, what is this song you hear repeating, sung from the careless seeds I've sown? And that concept of those songs going from one to another, back and forth, and the importance of memory, the power of memory, that is one of the more important powers we own.
Thank you, Bulger.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Rosalie. I mean, you've been performing for, what, 45 years, or a long time. 55 years. Do you see, what do you think the music scene is today? Are younger people coming in?
Absolutely.
Okay.
When people ask me what I think is important in contemporary music, I tell them to listen to Los Lobos. They sing their roots music better than anybody, and they came by it honestly, and they make new music out of it that the children or the young people powerfully relate to in terms of what's going on. They make new things out of old all the time, and they use electric, acoustic, every kind of music and they you know, U2, some of those other people, they use the music that they own, and I believe a description, people are always asking what do you think folk music is. Sometimes it comes around that it's viable commercially, and then everybody thinks they just found it, you know. But it's always there, never goes away. People make music like that because they need it. And that's where it comes from. And they take what they know that they've learned. I mean, those things can save your life. And if you're in a black hole somewhere, some little fragment of a lullaby can save your life. I think that music is the most important music there is.
Thank you. Well, this might be a good time to end the session. It's just about time to end, and I really appreciate what you said just now. Mm-hmm. It talks. I think it's important to. We all know this as scholars, but ordinary people don't know that, and they think that the only thing that folk music is the privileged, staged kind of music.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about here is something very different. And I appreciate the discussion about urban folk music revival stuff, because there obviously it's, you know, different layers and different sources and things like that, but it seems to me that the four of us here and the people who shared from the audience are all people who constructed meanings for themselves out of rural, urban, and political and non-political sources, and so, okay, well, yes.
I would like to point out that there have been revivals in other countries.
Okay.
There's this big discussion in Britain about the revival,
Really?
and Ewan McCall and so on and so forth.
South
And-
America, Central
Yeah,
America.
and in France,
Everywhere.
I was in the, we
Africa.
moved there, you know, for my husband to study chemistry, but we were in the middle of the French revival. People were going out and learning the old songs and bringing them into the cities.
Yeah.
And I didn't know it, you know, I just,
When was
When
that?
1970, 72 to 76.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I identify what I think I am, which is a storyteller rather than, you know, that has to do with the sense of always wanting to know where the song comes from and why people sing it. And when you hear that in Central and South America, revivals, or you know, Violeta Parra and some of those people Victor Hara, who brought that tradition back, the tradition of singing together because you're fighting some
You have the common
battles.
cause, yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and it's been a very exciting session for me. Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
being
Oh, yes, yeah, yeah, this is the cool thing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say once again, if you came in late, please don't neglect to come to the demonstration concert this evening at 9:30, from 9:30 till 10:15. It's going to be directly across over in the Sun Valley room. And this concert is made possible through a generous little grant that was made by West Staff. And Rosalie will be there, and I will be there, and maybe my sister Heather will be there. I'm not sure how. Anyway, we're going to be talking about some of the things that we were doing back in those days. And I bet we're going to